The morning fog clung to Kensington Manor like a shroud of secrets waiting to be unveiled. Abigail Montrose stood at the window of the nursery, watching the mist roll across the carefully manicured gardens, unaware that this would be her last peaceful moment within these walls. Behind her, Charlotte Kensington sat at her small writing desk, her golden curls catching the dim light as she practiced her letters with careful concentration. The child's tongue peeked from the corner of her mouth in that endearing way that never failed to make Abigail smile. 3 years had passed since Abigail first arrived at the manor, answering an advertisement for a governess position that seemed almost too good to be true. Fresh from the modest vicarage where she'd been raised by her late father, a country parson of limited means but limitless wisdom, Abigail had harbored no grand ambitions. She possessed neither fortune nor connections, only a thorough education courtesy of her father's insistence that a woman's mind deserved cultivation as much as any man's, and a gentle nature that seemed to attract the trust of children like flowers draw bees. The interview with Duke Edward Kensington had been brief and formal. He'd been recently widowed, his grief still raw and visible in the tightness around his eyes, in the way his hands gripped the arms of his chair as though steadying himself against an invisible storm. His daughter Charlotte, barely 4 years old at the time, had lost her mother to fever, and the household staff whispered that the child had not spoken a word since the Duchess's passing. Edward needed someone who could reach through that silence, someone patient and kind. He'd looked at Abigail with an expression that bordered on desperation masked by ducal composure, and asked only one question: "Do you believe children can heal?" Abigail had answered honestly, "I believe they can, Your Grace, if given love enough to feel safe in their grief." She'd been hired that very afternoon. The first months had been challenging in ways Abigail hadn't anticipated. Charlotte was a beautiful child with her mother's delicate features and her father's thoughtful grey eyes, but she existed in a world of profound silence. She would sit for hours clutching a small porcelain doll that had belonged to the late Duchess, staring at nothing, responding to nothing. The other servants treated the situation with a mixture of pity and superstition, whispering that the child was cursed or simple-minded, that grief had broken something essential within her. Abigail refused to accept such pronouncements. She began slowly, making no demands, simply being present. She would read aloud from picture books, describing each illustration in careful detail. She would sing the lullabies her own mother had sung before consumption claimed her when Abigail was 12. She would sit beside Charlotte in the gardens, naming flowers and birds, weaving stories about fairy kingdoms and brave princesses. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. The first breakthrough came on a rainy afternoon when Abigail was reading from a collection of fairy tales. She'd reached a particularly dramatic moment when the heroine faced a terrible dragon, and she'd embellished the tale with theatrical voices and gestures. Charlotte had looked up, and for the first time something flickered in those grey eyes, not quite a smile, but an awakening. A week later, while they walked through the rose garden, Charlotte had suddenly reached out and grasped Abigail's hand. The touch was tentative, testing, but it held. 2 months after that, during afternoon tea, Charlotte had whispered a single word: more. She wanted more cake. It was the most beautiful sound Abigail had ever heard. From that moment, their bond deepened into something profound and unbreakable. Charlotte began to speak in full sentences, then in flowing streams of consciousness, as though making up for lost time. She laughed freely, ran through the halls with childish abandon, and clung to Abigail with a fierce devotion that spoke of both trust and need. The household transformed along with the child. Servants smiled more readily. The oppressive grief that had saturated every corner of the manor began to lift like morning mist. Duke Edward noticed the change in his daughter, and his gratitude manifested in small but meaningful ways. He began joining them for afternoon tea, at first awkwardly, as though unsure of his place in the domestic rituals Abigail had established. But Charlotte would pull him into conversations about her lessons, her discoveries in the garden, her dreams and imaginings, and Edward would listen with an attention that bordered on reverence. He started requesting that Abigail provide him with reports on Charlotte's progress, but these formal meetings would often drift into longer conversations about philosophy, literature, and the challenges of raising a sensitive child in a world that could be harsh and unforgiving. Abigail found herself looking forward to these discussions more than was perhaps appropriate for someone in her position. Edward Kensington was not what she'd expected from a duke. Yes, he possessed the bearing and authority of his station, but beneath the formal exterior lived a man of surprising depth and kindness. He treated servants with respect, listened more than he spoke, and carried his grief with a dignity that never diminished his capacity for tenderness toward his daughter. When he looked at Abigail, it was not with the dismissive glance of aristocracy toward hired help, but with genuine appreciation. He saw her, truly saw her, in a way that made her heart respond with dangerous warmth. She told herself it meant nothing. He was grateful for what she'd done for Charlotte. That was all. To imagine anything more would be foolish beyond measure. Yet she couldn't quite suppress the flutter in her chest when their fingers accidentally brushed while reaching for the same book, or the way her pulse quickened when he smiled at something clever Charlotte said, and his eyes would seek hers as though to share the moment. The peaceful rhythm of their days might have continued indefinitely if not for the arrival of Lucinda Beaumont. Lucinda descended upon Kensington Manor like a beautifully dressed storm, all calculated charm and strategic grace. She was the daughter of a baronet whose fortunes had diminished considerably, leaving her with a title but little means to support it. At 28, she'd been on the marriage market for over a decade, her beauty beginning to fade at the edges, despite her best efforts with cosmetics and strategic lighting. She needed to secure a husband of means and position, and she needed to do it soon. Duke Edward Kensington, wealthy and titled and tragically widowed, represented exactly the opportunity Lucinda had been waiting for. She'd engineered an introduction through mutual acquaintances, presenting herself as a family friend, paying a courtesy call. Edward, who'd been largely isolated since his wife's death, accepted the visit with polite reserve. Lucinda had arrived with expensive gifts for Charlotte and flattering attention for Edward, speaking eloquently about her own refined upbringing and her thoughts on proper education for young ladies of quality. Abigail had been present for that first meeting, as Edward had requested she bring Charlotte to the drawing room to meet their guest. She'd watched Lucinda's eyes sweep over her with barely concealed disdain, categorizing and dismissing her in a single glance. The woman had pointedly ignored Abigail's presence, while lavishing attention on Charlotte with a performance of maternal interest that rang utterly false to anyone paying attention. Charlotte had responded with polite but cool reserve, answering Lucinda's questions in monosyllables before pressing closer to Abigail's side. After Lucinda departed, Charlotte had pronounced her judgment with childish honesty. "I don't like that lady, Papa. She smells too sweet and her smile doesn't reach her eyes like Abigail's does." Edward had laughed and kissed his daughter's forehead. "You're very observant, little one. We'll see if Mrs. Beaumont calls again." But call again she did, and again, and again. Lucinda had established herself as a frequent visitor, always arriving with some pretext. She'd heard of a marvelous piano teacher. She'd discovered a charming shop that sold the most delightful ribbons for little girls. She simply felt that dear Edward must be so lonely in this great house. Her campaign was relentless and increasingly transparent. Edward bore these attentions with patient courtesy, but no enthusiasm. Abigail, who'd become skilled at reading his subtle expressions, could see the weariness in his eyes when Lucinda's carriage appeared in the drive, the way his jaw tightened slightly when she launched into another monologue about her accomplishments or her vision for how Kensington Manor might be improved with a woman's touch. Lucinda, for her part, grew increasingly frustrated by Edward's polite distance. She'd expected her beauty and breeding to secure his attention quickly. She'd anticipated that a lonely widower would be grateful for feminine company and eager to remarry for his daughter's sake if nothing else. Instead, Edward remained cordial but remote, showing none of the romantic interest she'd been cultivating so carefully. It didn't take long for Lucinda to identify the obstacle to her plans. She began to notice how Edward's expression softened when Abigail entered a room, how his attention would shift naturally to the governess during Lucinda's visits, seeking her input on matters concerning Charlotte, sometimes continuing conversations they'd apparently begun earlier. She observed the easy familiarity between them, the way they communicated in glances and half-finished sentences, like two people who'd grown accustomed to each other's rhythms. Most damning of all, she watched Charlotte cling to Abigail with obvious adoration, while treating Lucinda herself with barely masked antipathy. The governess was in her way, and Lucinda Beaumont had not spent a decade clawing her way through society's marriage market to be thwarted by a common hired woman with no connections and no prospects. She began her campaign subtly at first. Pointed comments about the unusual degree of familiarity between Edward and his daughter's governess. Suggestions that perhaps Charlotte was becoming too attached to her caretaker in an unhealthy way, that it might be better for the child to be prepared for eventual separation as she grew older and required different tutors. Observations that some might find it inappropriate for a duke to spend so much time in private consultation with a woman of Abigail's station, regardless of how innocent the circumstances. Edward had dismissed these insinuations with cold finality. "Miss Montrose's position in this household is secure and valued," he'd said in a tone that brooked no argument. "I'll thank you not to question arrangements that concern only my family and my staff." Lucinda had smiled and apologized prettily, but her eyes had glittered with calculation. Subtle approaches had failed. It was time for more direct action. The opportunity presented itself during an afternoon gathering Edward had reluctantly agreed to host. Several neighboring families had been invited for tea, and Lucinda had naturally included herself among the guests. She'd arrived early, ostensibly to help with preparations, wearing her finest gown and her mother's jewelry, including a distinctive gold bracelet set with small rubies that had been in her family for generations. Abigail had been occupied with Charlotte during the gathering, keeping the child entertained while the adults socialized. They'd retreated to the nursery after Charlotte dutifully greeted the guests, and Abigail had helped her change from her formal dress into more comfortable afternoon clothes. They'd spent a pleasant hour with watercolors before Charlotte's afternoon rest time. It was only later, after the guests had departed, that the household was thrown into chaos by Lucinda's piercing cry of distress. Her bracelet was missing. The precious family heirloom had vanished from her wrist sometime during the gathering. She'd noticed its absence only upon returning home and had rushed back to Kensington Manor in a state of theatrical anguish. The house was searched thoroughly. Every room where guests had gathered was examined. Servants were questioned, and the bracelet remained unfound. Until Charlotte's chambermaid Mary emerged from the nursery carrying the missing jewelry. "She'd discovered it," she said with obvious reluctance and confusion, tucked inside the pocket of Abigail's work apron, the simple cotton garment Abigail wore over her dress during nursery duties. The accusation fell like an executioner's blade. Abigail stood in Edward's study, her face pale but composed, as Lucinda wept elegant tears and expressed her shock and disappointment. She'd never have suspected, she said with perfect calculated sorrow, that someone who seemed so respectable could commit such a betrayal. She knew servants were sometimes tempted by the possessions of their betters, but she'd truly believed Miss Montrose to be different. It broke her heart to think of it. Edward's expression was unreadable as he questioned Abigail. Had she taken the bracelet? Did she have any explanation for how it came to be in her possession? Abigail met his gaze steadily, though her hands trembled where she'd clasped them in front of her. "No, Your Grace. I did not take Mrs. Beaumont's bracelet. I have no knowledge of how it came to be in my apron. I can only tell you that I am innocent of this accusation." "She's lying," Lucinda interjected, her voice catching with perfectly performed emotion. "The evidence is irrefutable. The bracelet was found among her belongings. What other explanation could there possibly be?" Edward looked between them, and Abigail saw something flicker in his eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or pain at being forced into this position. She understood, with sinking certainty, the impossible situation facing him. A duke could not simply dismiss accusations of theft from a guest of breeding and station, not when the evidence appeared damning. To do so would suggest improper favoritism, would invite scandal and gossip that could damage his standing and Charlotte's future prospects. "Miss Montrose," Edward said quietly, and the formality of her title from his lips felt like a death knell. "Given the circumstances, I'm afraid I have no choice but to terminate your employment, effective immediately. You'll be provided with your wages through the end of the month, and a letter of reference stating that you left due to a change in the household's needs. The letter of reference was a mercy she hadn't expected, a quiet acknowledgement that he didn't want to destroy her chances of future employment entirely. But it did nothing to ease the crushing weight of injustice settling over her chest. "I understand, Your Grace," she managed, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "I would ask only that I be permitted to say goodbye to Lady Charlotte." "That won't be necessary," Lucinda cut in smoothly. "Best not to prolong the child's distress with an emotional farewell." Edward's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Mrs. Beaumont is correct. It would be easier for Charlotte if you simply departed. Mary will help you pack your belongings." Abigail had nodded, curtsied with mechanical precision, and turned toward the door. Each step felt like walking through water, her limbs heavy with grief and shock. This couldn't be happening. After 3 years of devotion, of love freely given and returned, she was being cast out like a criminal based on false accusations and manufactured evidence. The packing of her belongings took less than an hour, a stark reminder of how little she possessed in material terms. 3 simple dresses, undergarments carefully mended over the years, a worn pair of walking boots, her father's Bible with his handwritten notes in the margins, and a small collection of books she'd accumulated. Mary helped in heavy silence, the young maid's eyes red-rimmed with tears she kept wiping away with her apron. "It's not right, miss," Mary whispered as she folded Abigail's nightdress. "Everyone below stairs knows you'd never steal nothing. You're the kindest person in this whole manor. It's that Mrs. Beaumont what done it somehow. I'd stake my life on it." Abigail touched the girl's shoulder gently. "Don't speak such things, Mary. You'll only bring trouble on yourself. Whatever has happened, it's done now. I must accept it and move forward." But acceptance felt impossible as she closed her small trunk and took one last look around the modest room that had been her sanctuary for 3 years. The window overlooked the gardens where she'd walked with Charlotte countless times, teaching her the names of flowers and insects, making up stories about the stone fountain where sparrows came to bathe. From here she could see the oak tree where Charlotte had first climbed with Abigail's encouragement, conquering her fear of heights with determined focus and emerging triumphant among the lower branches. How could she leave without saying goodbye? The thought of Charlotte waking tomorrow to find her simply gone, with no explanation, no farewell, felt like a violence against everything they'd built together. But she had no choice. Edward's word was law within these walls, and she had neither the power nor the right to defy him. She descended the servants' stairs for the last time, her trunk carried by one of the footmen who wouldn't meet her eyes. The back entrance awaited, the proper exit for dismissed staff. No grand farewell, no acknowledgement of years of faithful service, just a quiet removal, as though she'd never existed within these walls at all. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtyard as Abigail stepped outside. A cart had been arranged to take her to the village where she could catch the mail coach. She had enough wages to secure modest lodgings while she sought new employment, though the prospect of finding another position without proper references felt overwhelming. The carefully worded letter Edward had promised would help, but it would also raise questions. Why had she left such an excellent placement? Prospective employers would wonder, would speculate, and some would inevitably hear whispers of the theft accusation. She was ruined, even if not formally accused. Lucinda Beaumont had destroyed her with surgical precision. Abigail had just placed her foot on the cart step when a child's voice pierced the quiet afternoon like a clarion call. "No, Abigail, wait. Papa, you have to wait." Charlotte burst through the manor's side door, still in her afternoon dress, her golden curls flying wild around her face. She ran with the desperate speed of a child who'd just woken from her rest to discover catastrophe unfolding. Behind her, moving with far more measured dignity but equal determination, came Duke Edward, his expression unreadable. Charlotte reached Abigail and threw herself at her governess with such force that Abigail had to steady herself against the cart. Small arms wrapped around her waist with fierce strength, and Charlotte's face pressed against her bodice as sobs began to shake the child's small frame. "You can't go," Charlotte wept. "You can't leave me, Abigail. Please don't go. I love you. You're all I have left of feeling safe and happy and loved. Please." Abigail's own tears, held back through sheer will until this moment, began to fall freely. She knelt so she could embrace Charlotte properly, holding her close and stroking her hair with trembling hands. "Oh, sweetheart, my darling girl, I don't want to leave you. You must believe that, but I have no choice." "But you do have a choice," Charlotte insisted, pulling back just enough to look up at Abigail with tear-streaked cheeks and eyes blazing with determination. "Papa has a choice. He can make you stay if he knows the truth." "Charlotte," Edward said quietly, having reached them. His face was drawn, conflicted, and something in his eyes made Abigail's heart clench. "We've discussed this. Miss Montrose must go. The circumstances are lies." Charlotte whirled to face her father, her small body vibrating with righteous fury. "Mrs. Beaumont is a liar, and you're letting her win because you don't know what I saw." Edward's expression shifted from conflicted to alert. "What you saw, Charlotte, what are you talking about?" The child took a shuddering breath, visibly trying to compose herself the way Abigail had taught her when emotions threatened to overwhelm clear thinking. When she spoke again, her voice still trembled, but carried the weight of absolute conviction. "I saw Mrs. Beaumont put the bracelet in Abigail's apron pocket. I was awake during rest time because my stomach hurt from the fancy cakes at the party. I came out of my room to find Abigail to ask for peppermint tea, and I saw Mrs. Beaumont in the nursery. She was standing by the table where Abigail always leaves her apron when we do messy activities. She looked around like she was checking if anyone was watching, and then she pulled something gold and shiny from her wrist and pushed it deep into the apron pocket. Then she left very quickly. I didn't understand what she was doing, so I didn't say anything. But when Mary found the bracelet there and everyone said Abigail stole it, I knew Mrs. Beaumont put it there on purpose to make everyone think Abigail was a thief." The words hung in the air like thunder preceding a storm. Abigail felt the world tilt and resettle around her, hope and disbelief warring in her chest. Edward's face had gone very still, but his eyes blazed with something that might have been fury carefully leashed. "Charlotte," he said, his voice deadly calm, "you're absolutely certain of what you saw. This is not something we can be mistaken about. If you're not completely sure—" "I'm sure, Papa." Charlotte's chin lifted with fierce pride. "I know what I saw. Mrs. Beaumont put her bracelet in Abigail's pocket to make it look like Abigail stole it. She did it because she wants Abigail to go away. She thinks if Abigail leaves, you'll marry her instead. But you can't, Papa. You can't marry someone so mean and dishonest. And you can't let Abigail leave when she didn't do anything wrong." The child's voice broke on the last words, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Abigail is the only person besides you who makes me feel like Mama's love is still here. She tucks me in the way Mama used to. She sings Mama's songs. She makes me feel safe when I miss Mama so much it hurts. And I think—" Charlotte's voice dropped to a whisper, but in the quiet courtyard it carried clearly. "I think maybe Abigail could be like a Mama to me someday. Not replacing Mama. Nobody could ever replace her, but being someone who loves me the same way. And I think you like her too, Papa. I see how you smile when she comes into the room. I hear you laugh when she says something clever. You're different when she's here. You're more like you used to be before Mama died." The silence that followed was profound and electric. Abigail couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't process the enormity of what had just been revealed. Charlotte had witnessed the deception. She was innocent. The relief was almost painful in its intensity, but it was nothing compared to the child's other revelation. The hope in those words, that Abigail could be a mother to her, that Edward's regard might be more than simple respect, felt too fragile and precious to acknowledge. Edward stood utterly still, his gaze fixed on his daughter with an expression of dawning understanding and carefully controlled rage. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the cold authority of his title and station. "Abigail, please wait here. Charlotte, come with me. We're going to address this matter immediately." He took Charlotte's hand and turned back toward the manor, but paused after only a few steps. Looking back over his shoulder at Abigail, he said quietly, "You have my word that justice will be done. Please don't leave." They disappeared into the manor, leaving Abigail standing beside the cart in a state of numb shock. The footman who'd been waiting to drive her shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain whether he should stay or go. Mary had followed Charlotte outside and now stood nearby, her face alight with fierce satisfaction. "I knew it," the maid breathed. "I knew that woman was poison from the moment she first slithered through our doors. And Lady Charlotte, bless her brave little heart, she set it right. You'll see, miss, His Grace won't let this stand." Inside the manor, Edward found Lucinda in the drawing room where she'd installed herself after the confrontation in his study, taking tea as though she belonged there. She looked up with a carefully crafted expression of sorrowful concern as he entered with Charlotte. "Edward, I'm so sorry you had to deal with such unpleasantness today," she began, her voice dripping false sympathy. "I know how difficult it must be to dismiss someone you trusted, but truly, it's for the best. Charlotte deserves caregivers of impeccable character, and now that the governess is gone, perhaps I might help you find someone more suitable. Be quiet." The words were spoken softly, but they carried such cold fury that Lucinda's mouth snapped shut mid-sentence. Edward's eyes had gone the color of storm clouds, and his entire bearing radiated barely contained rage. "My daughter has something to tell me about the events of this afternoon," Edward continued in that same dangerously quiet tone, "and you're going to listen very carefully, because your response will determine whether I simply have you removed from my property or whether I make it my personal mission to ensure every drawing room in England knows exactly what kind of woman you are." Lucinda's face paled, but she recovered quickly, her expression shifting to confused innocence. "I don't understand. What could Charlotte possibly—" "I saw you," Charlotte said, her voice steady now, strengthened by her father's support. "I saw you put your bracelet in Abigail's apron pocket. You did it on purpose, so everyone would think she stole it. You lied to get her sent away." The color drained completely from Lucinda's face, then flooded back in mottled patches of red. "That's absurd. The child is confused, Edward. She's upset about her governess leaving and she's making up stories. My daughter does not lie." Edward cut across her protest with Arctic precision. "She has never lied to me, not once in her entire life. When she says she saw something, I believe her absolutely. You, on the other hand, have proven yourself to be exactly the kind of manipulative, cruel opportunist I've long suspected you to be." Lucinda's mask of gentility cracked completely. Her eyes flashed with anger and desperation. "How you can't believe a child over me. I'm a baronet's daughter. My family has standing and connections. That governess is nobody, nothing but hired help who's clearly developed inappropriate attachments and turned your daughter against proper society." "Enough." Edward's voice cracked like a whip. "You entered my home as a guest and abused that hospitality to commit a calculated act of cruelty against an innocent woman. You manufactured evidence to destroy her reputation and livelihood. You traumatized my daughter by forcing her to witness injustice. And you did all of this purely to eliminate someone you perceived as an obstacle to your mercenary designs on my title and fortune." He took a step closer to Lucinda, his height and bearing suddenly intimidating in a way that reminded everyone present the Dukes wielded considerable power when roused to use it. "Let me be absolutely clear about several things. First, I have never had and will never have any romantic interest in you whatsoever. Your frequent visits have been tolerated out of courtesy, nothing more. Second, even if I were inclined to remarry, I would never consider someone capable of such calculated deception and cruelty. Third, you are never to set foot on my property again, and if I hear that you've spoken a single word against Miss Montrose or attempted to damage her reputation in any way, I will use every resource at my disposal to make certain that you find no welcome in any respectable home in England." Lucinda's face had transformed into something ugly, with rage and humiliation. "You're a fool," she spat. "Everyone will know you dismissed me to keep your precious governess. They'll say you're besotted with a common woman, that you've forgotten your station and your duty to your daughter to maintain proper standards." "They'll say whatever I tell them to say," Edward replied with chilling calm. "And what I'll tell them, should anyone ask, is that Mrs. Lucinda Beaumont was discovered attempting to steal from my household and blame an innocent servant. I have my daughter as witness. I have the bracelet that was found exactly where you placed it. And I have the considerable influence that comes with my title. Who do you imagine society will believe?" The calculation was visible in Lucinda's eyes as she weighed her options and found them all wanting. She was beaten, and she knew it. With a sound of pure fury, she swept toward the door, then paused long enough to deliver one final poisonous observation. "You'll regret this. A duke and his governess. It's indecent, unnatural. She'll never be accepted, and neither will your daughter once people realize you've elevated a servant above her proper station. You're destroying both their futures for sentiment." Then she was gone, the door slamming behind her with enough force to rattle the windows. Edward stood still for a long moment, his breathing carefully controlled as he mastered his anger. Then he looked down at Charlotte, who'd remained brave and quiet throughout the confrontation. His expression softened completely as he knelt before her. "You were extraordinarily courageous, little one. Speaking the truth when it's difficult is one of the hardest things a person can do, and you did it perfectly. I'm proud of you beyond words." Charlotte threw her arms around his neck. "Are you going to ask Abigail to stay? Are you going to tell her she doesn't have to leave?" Edward held his daughter close, and over her shoulder his eyes held an expression of dawning realization. "Yes," he said quietly. "I'm going to ask her to stay, though perhaps not quite in the way you might expect." He rose, taking Charlotte's hand, and together they walked back through the manor toward the courtyard where Abigail waited. Edward's mind worked rapidly, pieces falling into place with sudden clarity. Charlotte's innocent observation had forced him to confront something he'd been carefully not examining for months. The warmth he felt in Abigail's presence. The way his day felt more complete when they shared conversation. The quiet joy of watching her with Charlotte, seeing the love between them that was real and unforced and pure. The devastating emptiness he'd felt when he thought he'd have to send her away. Lucinda's accusations had been vile and false, but they'd been built on a foundation of truth he'd been avoiding. He did care for Abigail Montrose in a way that transcended employer and employee, transcended simple gratitude for services rendered. Somewhere in the past 3 years, amid ordinary moments of shared smiles and conversations, she'd become essential to his peace, to his happiness, to his vision of what his life could be. The question was whether he had the courage to act on that recognition, and whether she could possibly feel the same. They emerged into the courtyard to find Abigail exactly where they'd left her, though she'd been joined by several servants who'd clearly heard some version of events and had come to offer support. The housekeeper, Mrs. Morrison, stood beside her with a protective hand on her shoulder. The groundskeeper and 2 footmen waited nearby with expressions of poorly concealed hostility toward anyone who'd dare harm someone they'd come to respect. Abigail's eyes found Edward's immediately, and the hope and uncertainty in her expression made his chest constrict. She looked so vulnerable standing there, her simple dress and worn traveling cloak marking her station, her humble trunk at her feet a reminder of how little protection she had in the world. Yet her spine was straight, her chin lifted with quiet dignity that spoke of inner strength no circumstance could diminish. "Miss Montrose," Edward said, and his formal tone made her tense visibly. He quickly amended, softer. "Abigail, please forgive me. I was wrong to doubt you even for a moment. Charlotte has explained what she witnessed, and the truth of Mrs. Beaumont's deception is now clear. You're owed an apology that I fear is inadequate to the harm done, but I offer it nonetheless with my deepest regret." Abigail's breath released in a shaky exhale. "You believed your daughter's word over false evidence. That speaks to your integrity, Your Grace, not to any failing. And you offered me the mercy of a reference, even when you thought I'd betrayed your trust. I hold no anger toward you. Your generosity in the face of injustice only confirms what I already knew, that you're a person of exceptional character." Edward hesitated, aware of the servants watching, aware that what he said next would be witnessed and remembered and repeated throughout the household and beyond. Some aristocrats would consider that a reason for caution. Edward found it clarifying. Truth should be spoken in the light, not hidden in shadows. "My daughter made another observation today that forced me to examine feelings I've been reluctant to acknowledge. She noted that you've become essential to this household in ways that transcend your role as governess. She expressed hope that you might someday be a mother to her, not to replace the one she lost, but to provide the love and guidance every child deserves. He paused, his gaze steady on hers. And she noted that I'm different when you're near. Happier, more myself than I've been since my wife's death. She wasn't wrong. Abigail's eyes widened, and her hand came up to press against her heart as though to steady its sudden racing. Around them, the servants had gone utterly still. For 3 years you've been part of our lives, Abigail. You've brought light back to a house that had grown dark with grief. You've given my daughter the gift of joy and security. And you've reminded me, in ways both subtle and profound, that life continues even after loss, that happiness can be found again if one has the courage to reach for it. Edward took a step closer, closing some of the distance between them. I'm not asking this the way I should. There should be flowers and poetry and proper courtship. But today has reminded me that life is uncertain, and precious things can be lost in an instant through hesitation and fear. He drew a breath, then spoke words that would change everything. Abigail Montrose, would you consider remaining at Kensington Manor not as my daughter's governess but as my wife? Would you consider becoming the Duchess of Kensington, Charlotte's mother in truth, and my partner in all things? The courtyard erupted in gasps and whispers, but Abigail heard none of it. She stared at Edward as though he'd just spoken in a language she didn't quite understand, but was desperate to translate correctly. Your Grace, she breathed, then shook her head. Edward, I'm not of your world. Lucinda was right about that much, at least. The scandal, the talk, the damage to Charlotte's prospects will be managed by me and my title, and my absolute refusal to care what small-minded people think, Edward interrupted firmly. Charlotte needs a mother who loves her, which you already do. I need a partner I respect and trust and care for deeply, which I've come to realize you are. The rest is merely noise, and I've never been much concerned with noise. Charlotte had been watching this exchange with barely contained excitement. Now she pulled free from her father's hand and ran to Abigail, grasping her hand with both of hers. Please say yes, Abigail. Please be my mother. I love you so much, and I know Mama would be happy that I have someone who takes such good care of me and makes Papa smile again. Please stay with us forever. Abigail looked down at the child she'd loved from the moment she first coaxed a smile from her, then up at the man who'd somehow crept into her guarded heart, despite every attempt at professional distance. The future he was offering seemed impossibly beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, a leap of faith that defied every practical consideration. But hadn't she learned in these past 3 years that the most important things in life couldn't be measured by practical standards? Love wasn't practical. Family wasn't practical. The bonds that truly mattered existed in defiance of logic and station and social convention. Yes, she whispered, then stronger. Yes, if you're certain this is what you want, what you both want, then yes. I'll stay. I'll marry you. I'll be Charlotte's mother and your wife, and I'll do everything in my power to make us a true family. Edward's smile transformed his face, erasing years of grief and care in an instant. He closed the remaining distance between them and took her free hand, Charlotte still held the other, and raised it to his lips in a gesture of reverence that made Abigail's eyes fill with tears. Around them, the servants broke into spontaneous applause and cheering. Mrs. Morrison was openly weeping with joy. The footmen were grinning like fools, and Charlotte laughed with pure delight, bouncing on her toes with excitement too large to be contained. The future had shifted in the space of an afternoon, transformed by a child's courage to speak truth and a man's willingness to follow his heart despite convention. As the sun began its descent toward evening, painting the courtyard in shades of gold and amber, Abigail found herself enfolded in an embrace with Edward and Charlotte, 3 people who'd been wounded by loss finding healing in each other. The road ahead would not be without challenges. Society would gossip and speculate. There would be those who looked down on a duke who'd married his governess. But in this moment, surrounded by love freely given and returned, none of that seemed to matter at all. Part 3. Expanded version. The announcement of Duke Edward Kensington's engagement to Miss Abigail Montrose sent shockwaves through society that rippled outward from the manor like stones cast into still water. Within days, every drawing room in the county buzzed with speculation, judgment, and in some quarters, grudging admiration for the audacity of it all. A duke marrying his daughter's governess was the kind of scandal that would fuel gossip for months, perhaps years. Edward faced the storm with the same calm authority he'd brought to every other aspect of his life. He made no apologies and offered no elaborate explanations. When questioned by his peers, he simply stated that he'd found a woman of exceptional character and intelligence, whom he respected and cared for deeply, and whom his daughter adored. That she'd served as Charlotte's governess was circumstantial. He'd fallen in love with who she was, not what position she'd occupied in his household. The fact that Edward was a duke of considerable wealth and influence meant that while people might whisper behind his back, few dared express open criticism to his face. Those who did found themselves on the receiving end of such cold displeasure that they quickly learned to keep their opinions private. Edward's closest friends, the ones whose regard he actually valued, offered their genuine congratulations after meeting Abigail and recognizing the happiness that had returned to his eyes. But society's judgment found other ways to make itself known. The first formal test came barely a week after the engagement announcement, when Lady Pemberton, a distant cousin of Edward's and a woman known for her rigid adherence to social hierarchy, arrived unannounced for afternoon tea. She swept into the drawing room with two other society matrons in tow, their expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. Abigail had been upstairs with Charlotte when Mrs. Morrison came to fetch her, the housekeeper's face tight with concern. "Her ladyship is here, miss. She's asking for you specifically. His Grace is in the study with his steward, but I can send for him if you'd like." Abigail's stomach clenched with anxiety, but she forced herself to straighten her spine. "No, don't disturb him. I'll see to our guests myself. This is something I'll need to learn to handle." She changed quickly into one of her new afternoon dresses, a soft blue silk that Edward had insisted suited her complexion, and checked her appearance in the mirror. She looked respectable, she told herself, proper, like someone who might conceivably become a duchess, even if she didn't feel it in her bones. The drawing room felt like entering a lion's den. Lady Pemberton sat in the center position on the sofa, as though holding court, flanked by her companions. All three women's eyes swept over Abigail with undisguised assessment as she entered. "Lady Pemberton," Abigail said, executing what she hoped was an appropriate curtsy. "What an unexpected pleasure. May I offer you tea?" "How kind," Lady Pemberton replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We thought it only proper to call upon Edward's intended. After all, the announcement was so sudden, and we know so little about you, Miss Montrose. Or should I call you something else? The situation is rather unprecedented." The barb was delicate but unmistakable. Abigail felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady as she rang for tea. "Miss Montrose is perfectly appropriate until the wedding. I appreciate your concern for propriety." "Oh, we're terribly concerned," one of the other women chimed in, a sharp-featured lady whose name Abigail couldn't recall. "It must be quite overwhelming for you, making such a leap in station. From hired help to duchess. Why, it's like something from a novel. Though not perhaps the sort of novel one admits to reading." The implication that her story was scandalous fiction, improper and embarrassing, hung in the air. Abigail felt her composure beginning to crack, felt the old insecurities rising. Who was she to think she could navigate this world? These women had been born to it, raised in it, understood its rules in ways she never would. The tea arrived, giving her a moment to collect herself as she performed the ritual of pouring. Her hands trembled slightly, and she saw Lady Pemberton notice with satisfaction. "Tell me, Miss Montrose," the lady continued, accepting her cup with exaggerated care, as though worried the governess might spill it. "How exactly did this attachment develop? Edward has always been so proper, so conscious of his position and duties. It's remarkable that he would set aside such considerations for sentiment. His Grace and I developed a mutual respect over the years of my service to Lady Charlotte," Abigail replied, fighting to keep her voice from shaking. "Our regard for each other grew naturally from shared concerns for his daughter's well-being." "How convenient that your concern for the child should result in such an advantageous arrangement for yourself," the sharp-featured woman observed. "Some might say almost calculated." The accusation was barely veiled, suggesting Abigail had deliberately seduced Edward for her own advancement. The injustice of it, after everything she'd endured with Lucinda's false accusations, nearly broke her composure entirely. "I assure you, madam, nothing about our relationship was calculated," Abigail said, her voice tight. "I never sought anything beyond the privilege of caring for Charlotte and doing my duties faithfully." "Of course you didn't," Lady Pemberton purred. "And yet here you are, about to become a duchess. How very extraordinary." The conversation continued in this vein for another excruciating 20 minutes, each comment carefully crafted to remind Abigail of her inferior origins, her unsuitability, the scandal she was causing. By the time the women finally departed with false smiles and hollow wishes for her happiness, Abigail felt as though she'd been flayed alive. She stood alone in the drawing room after they left, her entire body trembling with humiliation and self-doubt. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps she was being foolish and selfish, thinking she could step into a world where she didn't belong. Perhaps Edward would come to regret his choice once the full weight of society's disapproval settled upon them both. "Abigail?" She turned to find Edward in the doorway, his expression dark with barely contained fury. He'd apparently encountered the departing guests on his way from the study. "Lady Pemberton felt the need to share her thoughts on our engagement as she left," he said tightly. "She suggested I was making a grave mistake that would damage Charlotte's prospects and my own standing. I informed her that her opinions were neither requested nor valued, and that she would not be welcome at Kensington Manor again until she learned proper respect for my future wife." Fresh tears spilled down Abigail's cheeks, despite her efforts to contain them. "Edward, perhaps they're not entirely wrong. I don't belong in your world. I don't know the rules, the expectations. I'll embarrass you at every turn, and Charlotte will suffer for it when she's older and seeking her own place in society." He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms with fierce tenderness. "Listen to me very carefully, my love. Those women are poisonous relics of a dying social order that values bloodlines over character and titles over genuine worth. They're afraid because you represent something they cannot control, the possibility that merit and love might matter more than breeding and connections." He cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You belong wherever I am, because I choose you. Charlotte belongs to the finest society because she's kind and intelligent and good, and you've helped make her that way. Anyone who suggests otherwise can go hang for all I care." "But the scandal will fade," he interrupted firmly. "People always find new scandals to fixate upon. In 6 months, some other duke will run off with an actress, or a baron will lose his fortune at cards, and will be forgotten. But even if we're not, even if we're whispered about for the rest of our lives, I don't care. I'd rather be happy with you and scandalous than respectable and miserable." Abigail clung to him, drawing strength from his certainty. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "Afraid I'll fail you. Afraid I'm not strong enough for this." "You're the strongest person I know," Edward said softly. "You took a broken, silent child and helped her find joy again. You brought light back into a house that had grown dark with grief. You faced false accusations with dignity and grace. You've already proven your strength 1,000 times over. All I'm asking is that you let me stand beside you while you continue being exactly who you are." She pulled back enough to search his face, finding nothing but love and absolute conviction. "You truly don't regret this? Don't regret choosing me?" "My only regret is that it took me so long to recognize what was right in front of me," he replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You're the best decision I've ever made, Abigail. Don't let small-minded people make you doubt that." They stood together in the quiet drawing room, holding each other while afternoon light slanted through the windows. Gradually, Abigail's trembling subsided, replaced by a tentative peace. Edward was right. She was strong enough for this. She'd survived worse than social disapproval, and with him beside her, she could face whatever came. For Abigail, the transformation from governess to duchess-to-be continued to feel like walking a tightrope between 2 worlds. Edward insisted she be fitted for an entirely new wardrobe, befitting her upcoming station, though he was careful to respect her natural modesty and preference for elegant simplicity over ostentatious display. She found herself studying etiquette books late into the night, determined not to embarrass Edward or Charlotte through ignorance of society's intricate rules. But Edward would find her bent over these books and gently close them, reminding her that she already possessed the qualities that mattered most: kindness, intelligence, and genuine care for others. The rest, he insisted, was merely performance, and she'd learn it in time without losing herself in the process. Charlotte bloomed with joy during this period, seemingly unaware of or unconcerned by the social complications her father's choice had created. She'd gained not only the promise of Abigail becoming her mother in truth, but also a new closeness with her father. The crisis had drawn the three of them together in profound ways, creating a family unit that felt natural and right. Charlotte began calling Abigail Mama within days of the engagement, testing the word tentatively at first, then with growing confidence when Abigail responded with tears of joy and warm embraces. They established new rituals as a family. Breakfast together each morning, where Charlotte would chatter about her plans for the day, while Edward read the paper and Abigail organized lessons. Afternoon walks through the gardens with all three of them, Charlotte running ahead to examine flowers or chase butterflies while Edward and Abigail followed at a more leisurely pace, their conversations ranging from the profound to the mundane. Evening reading time in the library, Charlotte curled between them on the sofa, while Edward or Abigail read aloud from whatever book had captured the child's imagination that week. These simple moments felt sacred to Abigail. She'd spent so much of her life on the periphery, the motherless daughter of a country parson, the hired help in grand households, always observing family life without being truly part of it. Now she stood at the center of something real and precious, and the gratitude she felt was almost overwhelming. Edward proved to be a patient and thoughtful fiancé. He was courting her properly now, he explained with a slight smile, even if they'd done things rather backward by starting with a proposal. He brought her flowers from the garden, not elaborate hothouse arrangements, but simple bouquets of her favorite wildflowers that he'd noticed she preferred. He asked about her opinions on everything from the menu for Charlotte's upcoming birthday celebration to his thoughts on agricultural improvements for the tenant farms. He made it clear through 1,000 small gestures that he valued her as an equal partner, not a subordinate he was elevating out of sentiment. Yet despite these growing comforts, doubt would creep in during quiet moments, particularly at night, when Abigail lay alone in her room and remembered Lady Pemberton's cutting observations, or the way servants in neighboring estates had looked at her during calls with barely concealed contempt. Was she being selfish, accepting Edward's proposal when it might damage his standing and Charlotte's future? Was love enough to bridge the vast gulf between their stations? One evening, about 3 weeks after the engagement, Edward asked Abigail to join him in the portrait gallery. She found him standing before the large painting of his late wife, the Duchess Catherine, who looked out from the canvas with serene beauty and gentle eyes remarkably similar to Charlotte's. Abigail stopped beside him studying the portrait. She'd seen it many times, but had never examined it closely, feeling it would be somehow intrusive. Catherine Kensington had been lovely in that ethereal way of women born to privilege and grace, her expression suggesting kindness and quiet intelligence. "I wanted you to see her properly," Edward said quietly. "Not as the spectre that haunts this house, but as the woman she was. Catherine was good and gentle, and I loved her truly. Our marriage was arranged, as most are in our circles, but we grew to care for each other deeply. She gave me Charlotte, and for that alone I'll be forever grateful." He turned to face Abigail, taking her hand. "But I need you to understand that what I feel for you isn't a betrayal of her memory or a desperate attempt to recreate what I lost. You're not a replacement, Abigail. You're someone entirely different, and my feelings for you are different as well." With Catherine, love grew slowly from friendship and companionship and duty fulfilled. With you, it's been built on respect and admiration and the gradual realization that you've become essential to my happiness in ways I didn't anticipate. Abigail's throat tightened with emotion. "I've worried," she admitted softly, "that I could never measure up to her, that Charlotte and you would always be comparing me to what you lost. She was born to this life, Edward. She understood how to be a duchess in ways I never will. Charlotte loves you for exactly who you are," Edward said firmly. "She doesn't want you to be her mother reborn. She wants Abigail, the woman who taught her to climb trees and catch frogs, who makes up silly songs and isn't afraid to get dirty in the garden, who holds her when nightmares come and celebrates her small victories with genuine joy." As for me, he raised her hand to his lips, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. I want the woman who challenges me in conversations, who isn't intimidated by my title, who loves my daughter as fiercely as I do, and who somehow saw past the grief-stricken widower to the man underneath who desperately wanted to learn how to live again. Abigail blinked back tears. She would have wanted Charlotte to be happy and loved. I'll honor her memory by being the best mother I can be to her daughter. Edward smiled. She would have liked you, I think. Catherine valued kindness and intelligence above all else. You possess both in abundance. You're both far better than I deserve, but I'm selfish enough to accept the gift anyway. They stood together before the portrait for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between the past and present. Then Edward led her to the library, where a fire burned low in the grate and evening shadows gathered in the corners. There's something else I need to say, Edward began, guiding her to sit beside him on the sofa. The wedding is planned for early autumn, giving Abigail time to adjust to her changing circumstances and allowing the initial scandal to die down somewhat. I wanted to marry you immediately, but I understand your reasoning for a longer engagement. He took both her hands in his expression serious. But I need you to know before we take those vows that I'm not entering this marriage with any illusions or reservations. I know exactly what I'm choosing, and I choose it freely and completely. You're not a convenient solution to Charlotte's need for a mother. You're not a replacement for what I lost. You're Abigail, brilliant and brave and beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with birth or breeding, and I love you for exactly who you are. Abigail felt something crack open in her chest, a flood of emotion so powerful it left her breathless. I love you too, she whispered. I've tried not to, tried to remember my place and maintain proper distance, but somewhere along the way you became essential to me. You and Charlotte both. The thought of leaving, even for those few horrible hours when I believed I had to go, felt like being torn apart. Edward pulled her closer, and she went willingly, resting her head against his shoulder. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the crackling fire and the distant sounds of the manor settling around them, the only accompaniment to their thoughts. I'm afraid sometimes, Abigail admitted quietly, afraid that the weight of society's judgment will eventually wear you down, that you'll wake up one day and realize you've sacrificed too much for me, that Charlotte will suffer because of choices I've made. Edward shifted so he could look directly into her eyes, his expression fierce with conviction. Then let me make you a promise, here and now before we stand before God and witnesses. I will never regret choosing you. Never. Society can whisper and judge and exclude us from their meaningless gatherings, and I will not care. Because at the end of each day I'll come home to you and Charlotte, to genuine love and honest connection, and that will matter more than 1,000 invitations to tedious balls. He cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. If Charlotte suffers anything, it will be from seeing her father happy and her new mother devoted, and learning that true worth has nothing to do with what name you're born with. So I'm teaching her that character matters more than circumstance, that love is worth fighting for even when the world disapproves. Those are lessons worth any social inconvenience. And if I fail, Abigail whispered, if I can't learn to navigate your world properly if I embarrass you, then I'll stand beside you and help you up, the same way you'd do for me if our positions were reversed, Edward interrupted softly. Abigail, marriage isn't about perfection. It's about partnership. It's about facing life's challenges together and choosing each other every day regardless of what comes. I'm not asking you to become someone you're not. I'm asking you to be exactly who you are, and let me love you for it. The simplicity and sincerity of his words broke through the last of her resistance. She leaned forward and kissed him, pouring into that gesture all the love and gratitude and hope she couldn't quite articulate. Edward responded with equal tenderness, his arms coming around her to hold her close, and for long moments the world narrowed to just the two of them, bound together by choice and affection and unshakable commitment. When they finally drew apart, both slightly breathless, Edward smiled. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He withdrew a small velvet box and opened it to reveal an exquisite ring, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, elegant without being ostentatious. "This was my grandmother's," Edward explained. "She was a formidable woman who married my grandfather against her family's wishes. He was a younger son with no prospects beyond his military commission, considered entirely unsuitable, but she loved him, and she chose him anyway, and they built a life together that was happier than most arranged matches among the highest circles. She used to tell me that the best marriages are built on genuine affection and respect, not social convenience." He slipped the ring onto Abigail's finger beside her simple engagement band. "I want you to have this as a reminder that you're not the first woman in this family to choose love over social approval, and that such choices can lead to extraordinary happiness. Wear it with pride, knowing you're carrying on a tradition of brave women who refuse to let society dictate their hearts." Abigail looked down at the ring through tear-blurred eyes, overwhelmed by the symbolism and the trust Edward was placing in her. "Thank you," she managed. "I'll treasure it, and I'll try to be as brave as your grandmother was." "You already are," Edward assured her. "You've been brave every day since you agreed to stay, knowing the challenges you'd face. That courage is one of the many reasons I love you." They sat together until the fire burned low and the moon rose outside the library windows, talking quietly about their hopes and fears, their plans for the future, the life they would build together. And gradually Abigail felt the last of her doubts settle into something manageable. Not gone entirely, but no longer overwhelming. With Edward beside her, promising his unwavering support and absolute devotion, she could face whatever society threw at them. The night before the wedding, Abigail found herself in her room, no longer the modest governor's quarters, but a proper guest chamber that would be hers only until tomorrow, when she'd move into the Duchess's apartments adjoining Edward's own. She stood before the mirror, examining her wedding dress with a mixture of awe and disbelief. It was beautiful in its simplicity, cream silk with delicate lace at the collar and sleeves, the cut elegant without being ostentatious. Edward had insisted on engaging London's finest modiste, but Abigail had worked with the woman to create something that felt true to herself, rather than a costume she was wearing for society's benefit. The result was a gown that made her look like a refined version of herself, rather than someone trying to be something she wasn't. A soft knock interrupted her reverie. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Morrison with some last-minute detail about tomorrow's arrangements. Instead, Charlotte slipped through the door already in her nightgown, her hair braided for bed. She carried something small and carefully wrapped in tissue paper. "I wanted to give you something before tomorrow," Charlotte said, climbing onto the bed and patting the space beside her in invitation. Abigail joined her, curious. "What is it, sweetheart?" Charlotte carefully unwrapped the tissue to reveal a delicate silver locket. Even before she opened it, Abigail recognized it from the portrait in the gallery. Catherine had worn it in the painting. "This was my mamma's," Charlotte explained, opening the locket to show two miniature portraits inside. One showed Catherine young and radiant. The other showed Edward, also younger, his face unlined by grief. "Papa gave it to her when I was born. She wore it always. After she died, Papa put it away because looking at it made him too sad. But yesterday I asked him if I could have it, and he said yes." The child looked up at Abigail with solemn grey eyes. "I want you to have it, not to keep Mama's picture. That one will go in my special memory box. But I want to put a new picture in here, one of you, so that when you become my Mama tomorrow, it will be official. The locket will have my new Mama's picture in it, and I can wear it on special occasions and remember that I'm very lucky, because I've had two wonderful Mamas who both love me very much." Abigail's vision blurred with tears. The generosity of the gesture, the maturity and emotional wisdom in this 7-year-old child, took her breath away. "Charlotte, that's... Are you certain? This is so precious, such an important connection to your mother." "Mama's not in the locket," Charlotte said, with the clarity of a child who'd thought deeply about profound things. "She's in here." She pressed her small hand over her heart. "And in the stories Papa tells me about her, and in the way you sing the songs she used to sing and make me feel safe the way she did. The locket is just a pretty thing, but if it has your picture in it, then it becomes a pretty thing that means I have a family again. A real whole family with a mama and a papa and me. That's what would make mama happiest, I think, knowing I'm loved and safe and that papa isn't sad anymore. Abigail pulled Charlotte into her arms, holding her close as tears streamed freely down her face. "I love you so much," she whispered. "Being your mother, truly and officially, is the greatest honor of my life. I promise I'll do everything I can to make you happy and help you remember your first mama, while also building new memories together." Charlotte hugged her tightly. "I know you will. That's why I'm not sad or worried at all. I'm just excited. Tomorrow you'll marry Papa and officially become my mama, and we'll be a real family. That's the best thing in the whole world." They sat together for a long while, talking about everything and nothing. About Charlotte's hopes for the future, about whether they should get a puppy, about what it would be like when Abigail was actually a duchess. Eventually, Charlotte's yawns grew too frequent to ignore, and Abigail walked her back to the nursery, tucking her in with a tenderness that came from the deepest parts of her heart. As she smoothed Charlotte's hair back from her forehead, the child caught her hand. "Abigail, I'm glad Mrs. Beaumont was mean and tried to get you sent away, because if she hadn't, Papa might never have realized he loved you, and you might never have become my mama. So something good came from something bad, which Papa says happens sometimes if you're patient and brave." Abigail smiled through fresh tears. "Your Papa is a very wise man, and you're a very wise little girl. Now sleep, sweetheart. Tomorrow is an important day for all of us." "The most important day ever," Charlotte agreed sleepily. "The day our family becomes official." Abigail returned to her own room with a heart so full it ached. She lay in bed for a long time, unable to sleep, thinking about the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. Tomorrow she would marry Edward. Tomorrow she would become Charlotte's mother in the eyes of God and law. Tomorrow she would step fully into a life she'd never imagined for herself. The fear was still there, lurking in the corners of her thoughts, but it was overwhelmed now by hope and love and the absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, she wouldn't face them alone. The wedding day dawned clear and golden, autumn asserting itself with crisp air and brilliant sunshine that seemed to bless the occasion. Abigail woke early, her stomach fluttering with nervous excitement. Mrs. Morrison arrived with breakfast she couldn't eat, followed by the lady's maid who'd been engaged to help her prepare. As she dressed, Abigail thought about the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she'd been simply a governess, content with her quiet life of service. She'd never dreamed of love or marriage, certainly never imagined herself standing on the threshold of becoming a duchess. But life, she'd learned, had a way of surprising you when you least expected it. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of emotion and sensory details that would remain forever etched in her memory. The chapel filled with warm morning light streaming through stained glass windows, the scent of roses and lavender, Charlotte's face, solemn with concentration as she carried the rings down the aisle with perfect precision. Edward waiting at the altar in formal attire, his eyes finding hers the moment she entered and never wavering, his expression holding such love and certainty that her nervousness dissolved completely. The vicar's words washed over her as she and Edward spoke their vows, promises to love and honor, to support and cherish through whatever circumstances life might bring. When Edward slid the ring onto her finger, his hands were steady and warm, and when she did the same for him, she felt the rightness of it resonate through her entire being. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the vicar intoned with satisfaction. "Your Grace, you may kiss your bride." Edward's smile was tender and private, meant only for her, as he cupped her face gently and kissed her. It was soft and sweet and full of promise, and when they drew apart, Abigail saw her own joy reflected in his eyes. The small gathering erupted in applause and cheers. Charlotte launched herself at them both, hugging their legs with fierce joy. "You're married," she announced unnecessarily, her voice ringing with triumph. "You're officially my mama now, and nobody can ever say different." The wedding breakfast that followed was filled with laughter and good wishes. The servants who'd known Abigail as one of their own now celebrated her elevation with genuine happiness, their toasts warm and heartfelt. Edward's closest friends, the few he'd invited, offered their congratulations with sincerity, that suggested they approved of his choice regardless of what society might say. Lord Ashworth, Edward's oldest friend, pulled him aside at one point and said with a grin, "You know the gossips will never let this go. Her duke marrying his governess. It's unprecedented scandal." Edward glanced across the room to where Abigail sat with Charlotte, both of them laughing at something Mrs. Morrison had said. His expression softened. "Let them talk. I've gained a wife I respect and admire. Charlotte has gained a mother who genuinely loves her, and I've rediscovered what it means to be truly happy. If that's scandalous, then I'm content to be a scandal." Ashworth followed his gaze and nodded approvingly. "She's good for you. I haven't seen you look this alive since before Catherine died. Hold on to that, Edward. Real happiness is rare enough in our world, worth more than 100 proper marriages built on duty and social advantage." As afternoon faded toward evening, Edward found a quiet moment to draw Abigail away from the celebrations. He led her to the rose garden, to the bench where they'd sat countless times during Charlotte's lessons, where their friendship had deepened gradually into something more. "Happy?" he asked, pulling her close against his side. Abigail leaned into him, marveling at the simple freedom to do so now without worry about propriety or crossing invisible lines. "Happier than I knew it was possible to be. Sometimes I still can't quite believe this is real. That I'm your wife, Charlotte's mother, the Duchess of Kensington. It feels like a dream I might wake from at any moment." "It's real," Edward assured her, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And it's forever. You're mine now, Abigail. My wife, my partner, my love. And I'm yours, completely and without reservation." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. From somewhere inside the manor came the sound of Charlotte's laughter, bright and joyful and free. "She's the one who made this possible, you know," Abigail said softly. "If Charlotte hadn't found the courage to speak the truth that day, I'd have left in disgrace. I'd never have known any of this." "She has your courage," Edward replied. "You taught her that truth matters, that speaking up for what's right is worth the risk. She learned that from watching you, from the example you set every day. You'd already made her into someone brave and good long before that moment came." Abigail thought about the child she'd met 3 years ago, silent, withdrawn, trapped in grief too large for a small body to contain, and she thought about the vibrant, confident little girl who now raced through the manor bringing joy wherever she went. The transformation had been gradual, built from thousands of small moments of patience and love and gentle encouragement. "We've all transformed each other," she reflected. "Charlotte found her voice again. You found your way back to happiness. And I found a family, a place where I truly belong. We healed each other." "The best families do," Edward agreed. He turned to face her, his expression serious now. "I know the path ahead won't always be easy. Society's judgment can be cruel, and there will be those who never accept you as my equal. But I need you to know that I'll stand with you through all of it. You're my Duchess, my wife, and anyone who disrespects you disrespects me. I won't tolerate it." "I know," Abigail said simply, "and together we'll face whatever comes. With you and Charlotte beside me, I can bear anything society throws at us." As darkness fell and stars began to emerge in the deepening sky, they returned to the manor hand in hand. Charlotte met them in the entrance hall, already changed into her nightgown despite the early hour, her face alight with determination. "I wanted to say good night properly," she announced, "because tonight is the first night you're officially married, so it should be special." She hugged Edward first, receiving his kiss on her forehead and his murmured words of love. Then she turned to Abigail, and her expression grew tender and wondering. "Good night, Mama," she said, testing the word now that it was official, letting it settle on her tongue with satisfaction. "I love you very much. Thank you for staying with us. Thank you for making us a family again." Abigail knelt so they were eye to eye, gathering Charlotte into her arms. "Thank you for being brave enough to tell the truth when it mattered most. Thank you for trusting me with your heart." "I love you, sweetheart. Being your mother is the greatest gift I've ever received." They held each other for a long moment, 3 people who'd been broken by loss and circumstance, now forged into something whole and strong and beautiful. When Charlotte finally pulled back, her smile was radiant with contentment. Mrs. Morrison appeared to escort Charlotte to bed, the elderly housekeeper's eyes suspiciously bright as she witnessed the family scene. As they disappeared up the stairs, Edward drew Abigail close once more. "Welcome home, Duchess Kensington," he murmured against her hair. "Welcome to the rest of our lives." Abigail smiled against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. Home, family, love. Simple words for extraordinary gifts that had come from the most unexpected places. The scandal of a duke marrying his governess would fade eventually, becoming just another story told in drawing rooms and country houses. But the love they'd built, imperfect and unconventional and absolutely real, that would endure. Through seasons and years, through challenges and celebrations, through all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that made up a life truly lived. And in the end, that was all that truly mattered. Dear listeners, if this story of courage, truth, and unexpected love touched your heart, we would be so grateful if you would subscribe to Echoes of Romance, leave us a comment sharing your thoughts, and give this story a like. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue bringing you tales of love that transcend all boundaries. Please activate your notifications so you never miss our next journey into romance. Thank you for listening, and may your own lives be filled with love as true and enduring as Abigail and Edward's. Until next time, dear friends.